Sure. I'm Jorge Vasquez, and I'm a founding partner of a law firm, Vasquez LLP.
Awesome. And what can you also say your credentials and your like city of like birth or the city that like you claim?
Yeah, sure. First and foremost, thanks for having me.
You already know, Jorge. I'm
Um,
like, okay, say your credentials.
yeah. So first and foremost, I'm a product of the public housing system and public school system. I'm born and raised in Manhattan's Lower East Side, Alphabet City, 4th and D. I went to undergrad and graduate school at SUNY Albany. I went to law school at Seton Hall University School of Law. After law school, I have an LLM in trial and advocacy, which is kind of like a postdoctorate for those who are thinking about like, what does that mean? Think about like a doctor, right? Like every surgeon goes to medical school, but after medical school, you have to get some more education. So then I have that more education from Temple, and then I was an Institute of Politics Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy. And that's, I guess, my academic credentials.
So far.
Yeah, so far.
Right. Fantastic. That's outstanding. I said, I was like, you're going to be a perfect example for our students. As you already know, my dad came here to Buffalo from Manhattan. He's from Rutgers Houses as a student. So it's so amazing to be able to like bridge the world between New York City and Buffalo and every other place in between. So thank you so much for coming. So do you want to say a little bit about your law practice and what made you start your own law firm?
Sure. So the law practice is a full service law firm, and we represent people in New York State. We have offices in New York City, an office in Albany, New York, an office in Newark, New Jersey, and an office in Coral Gables, Florida. So we're serving 3 states right now, and we have clients in Buffalo. Our primary focus is on cannabis. So for those who might not be aware, New York legalized adult recreational use cannabis back in March of 2021, and we're now seeing individuals get licensed. So we represent individuals who are looking to get licensed or have questions about the cannabis market, as well as your regular business stuff and civil rights work as well. So employment discrimination, business startups, questions about what kind of entity to start, whether you want to be a sole proprietor, which means that you don't necessarily have a formal entity behind your name, or if you want to start a limited liability company, a partnership, or you're just trying to figure out like, hey, I have a side hustle. This side hustle is going well. How can I make more money? How can I formalize it more? Then we're a law firm to kind of follow. And you can follow us on all social media platforms at V as in Vasquez, S as in Tigafa, LLP Law, and it's VSLLPlaw.com. But why we did it was my partner, Esperanza, was a partner at a major law firm. I was running a national democracy team out of D.C. for a group called Advancement Project. And prior to that, I was at the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, filing lawsuits on behalf of Latinos throughout the United States who were being discriminated in one fashion or another. And when COVID hit, what we saw was that a lot of our people were missing out on different aspects. So whether that was inability to qualify for PPP loans, whether that was any other kind of assistance, and Esperanza and I decided that, hey, what's missing in the legal profession is that you generally don't have someone who's civil rights minded and someone who's business minded representing the same clients. Often what happens is somebody gets what they think is a great deal, a great contract, and then later on they find out that they're being discriminated against or that their contract wasn't as fair as they thought it was, and they go to someone like me later on. So what we decided to do was to team up and make sure that we could represent our people from beginning to end and provide a service that's really unique in that if we're reviewing documents, we're not just reviewing it for for the legalese and for the legal protection, but also looking at it from a racial lens, from a lens of equity, and how can this serve the client as well as serving the community. And that's why we formed the law firm.
That's super cool. I call it values-based business. Willie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I do have a question, Mr. Vasquez. My name is Willie H. I'm one of the producers of the show. Okay, now there's a lot of people going into business, LLC, and I'm starting to find a lot of friends and family and associates getting into the cannabis. I want to ask, what can they do to find out? Because some are legal, some are not. So I know some people selling edibles and putting a little, I guess, cannabis.
So is your question, where can they get information?
Yes.
Okay.
That's my question.
His question is, where can they get information?
Sure. So if I can, I think the shops that are illegal and are popping up, I think that's a problem, right? And it's a problem because it's not the same people who were known as legacy market. The legacy market is people like my friends, people I grew up with, people like some of my relatives who, because of the war on drugs, were left without any options and needed to fend for themselves and their family.
Mm-hmm.
So they were doing, hand to hand. After the legalization, what we saw is that people who had no interest in this business and that are only looking to profit and deplete resources from our community started opening up storefronts. Mm-hmm. I was just in East Buffalo a few months ago and saw shops that would never survive or never be there if this wasn't legal. And they're completely unsafe. So you don't want to go to any of those shops. What you want to look for is the Office of Cannabis Management provides a sign that you could scan. Think of it like a QR code, where if an individual is walking into a dispensary to make sure that it's legal, they could scan it and make sure that the product that they're getting is actually the product that they want, versus something that might be contaminated. But the most important part is to understand that New York's market is the largest market in the country. No one consumes more cannabis than New York State. And what that means is that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
This isn't something that's small fry, which provides a unique opportunity for individuals who have been marginalized by the war on drugs.
Right, because I was going to say proportionally, like the value of the market versus what enforcement of prohibition kind of had an economic impact on our community. Conversely, it's like, I think I said about one of the businesses, it's like we're coming from a deficit almost. So like, even though there's this forecasted like huge amount of value, to your point with legacy businesses, some families have already suffered an economic impact because of the enforcement of prohibition, my family being one of them. So I think your work is remarkable.
Thanks. I think the stuff to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you think about legalization and equity is that the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which is the legislation and the law that legalizes recreational use cannabis in New York State, provides that at least 50% of all licenses need to go to social equity applicants. And a social equity applicant is defined as someone who's directly impacted, grew up in a community that was highly policed, over-policed, someone who's, Black, brown, veteran, or a woman. And that's super important because when I was at Latino Justice, we did research and we FOIA'd literally every police station in New York State for simple possession of marijuana crimes, which are generally penal law 220 or 221.
Jorge, say what a FOIA is.
Yeah, FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act. So because police stations are a government entity, you're allowed to ask them for whatever records you want.
Formally, everyone. Because I just wanted to stress that. Go ahead. Jorge.
Yeah. So in asking for those records, what we saw was that over 89% of individuals who were prosecuted and convicted were Latino or African American or Black and brown, however you want to coin it. And what that shows us is that we know that individuals use drugs at the same rate, notwithstanding whatever their race is. But rather what was happening was that the criminalization was focused on Black and brown people. And to Talia's point, when we look at what that means, you're talking about, six of hundreds of thousands of people who at a minimum pay the court system $150
right?
just to be
Because
processed.
I always tell people it costs money to go to jail. Like, it's not free
It does.
for you or
No,
for the
no.
people who are rooting for you.
Not at all, right? Like, you're going to pay processing fees. You're going to pay many times even for your lawyer fees. You're going to have to work if you're going to a state penitentiary. So all of these things have financial consequences. And now we're at a point where, these dispensaries should be 8-figure businesses. And that's the thing that's sometimes hard to wrap your head around. You're thinking like, this is just, a regular store. But, if you're talking about you should be generating over $10 million. And what does that mean when you should be generating $10 million and you're from East Buffalo? What does that mean when you're from West Buffalo? What does that mean if you're from the Crest in Rochester, right? You're talking about you're literally able to do a lot for the community, do a lot for business. You're allowed to pay people a living wage. And every dispensary is required to sign a labor agreement. And what that means is that you can't be anti-union.
Yeah, he's already pining to my labor side. You already know how I move. Let's go.
Yeah.
Labor strong.
Right. So you're able to bring back a new workforce. But more importantly, the way New York has rolled it out is they said that the people closest to the problem, the people who have been at the forefront, bearing the brunt of the war on drugs, are best to roll it out and to legalize it and to be the first owners.
So I had,
Go ahead.
I had New York Cannabis Times that I wrote about. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but this idea, and I've been trying to follow it on Instagram, of like where this voice lives, Jorge, and like how people from our communities bring that voice forward, and like also the community activists that are working to shape it. Because I feel like you acknowledged, people in the Latino community, they feel differently, right, about like either their impact or what it's happened. And that I'm part of my family's Pentecostal, and like having a conversation entre la iglesia sobre esto, tú sabes. So I feel like there's like two sides of advocacy, like you who's advocating within the system for the Latino voice, and then others who are working, and I know you are obviously dually, but working more like on the community level to like even figure out like how do we feel? Do you know?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, and I'm an elder at my church, and what I did was we started to just talk about the plant, and then we started to talk about facts. So we started talking about it as an institution, a religious institution, where the average person there could easily be my mother's mother, right? Like it could be my grandparents. And what we did was, when you talk about, do you know somebody who's been impacted by this, someone who had to leave their house, someone who couldn't qualify for school, right? How many kids right now at the state university, maybe when we were there, Talia, that started one semester and then maybe had to take a few semesters off or just leave because of simple possession of marijuana.
And then they never make it back.
Qualify, right, because you can't qualify for financial aid. Right, so that's the stuff that they're not telling you, is like you plead guilty to this charge when it was illegal, and then now you can't apply for financial aid. There's at least 4,000 consequences to a guilty cannabis plea, and because cannabis on the federal level is a Schedule I drug, believe it or not, for those listening, at the federal level, cocaine is considered less dangerous than cannabis. Right, so a nickel bag of cocaine is less dangerous or has less consequences than that of cannabis on the federal level. So that's what we're doing. But I think, Talia, to directly answer your question, we need to have these conversations with our family, right? Definitely. Right is right, wrong is wrong, and.
But also, like, you already know how I'm coming. Sorry, Jorge. Like, how do you educate people about the history of prohibition from a, like, socio-political perspective? Because, like, as you know, like, it was I use the word prohibition purposely, right? Because I feel like for some people, like, it conjures up a certain type of feeling. And I think for me, it's like, how do you start? Like, telling people the history of the 1930s or telling people the history of the indigenous use and like how did we get here. It's incredible like what you've been able to educate us in this short time. But like for me, I have two questions for you. From a historical perspective, what do you think is like the largest impact of the policy of prohibition and how you see that it's going to be reversed outside of like the economic? And then the second is like, what is it like to be at these prestigious institutions? Because as you acknowledged, you know, you and I come from similar backgrounds, being public housing residents and like coming from families who disproportionately didn't have access to education like that. Those are my two questions, Dali. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Those are kind of two bigger questions, so no pressure.
Yeah. So I think to your first point, I think we need to talk about prohibition from the historical standpoint, like you said, starting with the 1930s. And what we need to do specifically is we need to speak to our people the way our people speak. Too many times people who are formally educated or consider themselves leaders want to speak how they speak, right? And what I find is that if I'm speaking to a grandmother, I need to speak to that grandmother in the way that she
Como bendición.
Right, exactly. Right. And you can't just go and start talking about like, hey, did you know this was racist? It was more of, if you're in this country, if you were alive in the 1930s, if you're Black or brown, then you remember what discrimination was like. You remember what racism then was like. You remember the civil rights movement. So it's finding things that are relatable references, right? This idea that even the name, you know, marijuana is a play on Mexicans and meant to act as if Mexicans were more dangerous than anyone else. And
Thank you.
What we do there by bringing up that history is you remind people that there's a lot of just baggage and propaganda that came with saying this wasn't this or this wasn't that, and we're seeing similar things now with what they consider, you know, the opioid pandemic, right? Where we see that the treating of people who are using heroin or opioid addiction is a lot different than if you grew up in the 80s or 90s and saw individuals who look like you or have family members who were addicted to something. They were treated a lot different. We've always said, listen, we want holistic care. We want to make sure that our people are getting help. And now you see that, you know, because people are hitting it, is coming closer to home, that there's more sympathy there. But even in calling it the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, that came from activists saying, no, we're not calling it cannabis. Big Pharma tried to do cannabis. Lobbyists tried to do cannabis, and the Cannabis Act fell because the Cannabis Act didn't come with the historical aspect to Talia's point.
Right, and we're here. There are other voices like mine, Jorge, you already know, and we're passionate.
Right. yeah, no, and it's the idea of, listen, you know, we're taking children away from their parents because we're saying that their parents are consuming cannabis. We're saying that this grandmother who lives with her grandchild, who's watching their grandchild because maybe their parent is incarcerated or maybe their parent just isn't around, maybe even deceased, has to choose between living in public housing or living with their grandchild or living with their child, right? Why should a parent have to choose where they live at because their child was caught with a little bit of weed?
And you're talking about specifically families who face having to be relocated because people in their family have had a criminal conviction, and in some subsidized housing, for those of you who don't know, and or buildings like that equals eviction. For me, I think systematically it's like this kind of judgment or approach of like the socioeconomic historical impacts of poverty and a purposeful segregation without empathy or historical perspective. And that to me is just deafening, because it's like, well, ask yourself, how did we get here? And I think that goes to like my latter question. And I really want to ask you this question because I want to obviously ask you more questions because I have questions forever, but I want to be respectful of your time and try to end by 10:40. But what is it like to go to those prestigious institutions where like someone from her named Vasquez has never gone before, like to walk in those places and to represent those communities and oftentimes be the only person in the room who's doing so?
Yeah, it's dope. It's super, super dope. And I say that because a lot of the stuff that, and it's the same thing, Talia, right? Like we've known each other over 10 years.
Long time.
Well before you graduated law school, right? And the reality is the stuff that we've been talking about is things we were talking about before we were quote unquote formally educated. So when I'm in these quote unquote prestigious institutions, it's like you realize how they're really playing catch up on you. You're not playing catch up on them, right? Like these ideas and these struggles or these experiences that you go through in life, particularly if you grew up in an inner city, you kind of get to use that to your advantage because an institution is an institution, whether that's the public elementary school, whether that's, a public system that you had to go through, or whether that's a prestigious university, or whether that's the U.S. government, right? There are policies and procedures in place that you realize have been dismantling certain communities.
Yeah, like
and
pushing
then
us
being
out.
able to use that, right? And then being able to use that to benefit those communities is
So
really
did you
good
like physically go to
overall.
Harvard, like physically go there?
Yes.
So what was it like to be like physically Puerto Rican, physically at Harvard? Big Wepa. Like who, who in your family or like what person in your network was like, oh my goodness, and like approaching and you talking to you differently? Because I feel like that's like the big one, like the mic drop.
Yeah.
No offense to Stanford, but I have preferences.
I think the kind of like the part that was like, oh wow, was right. Like Harvard probably wouldn't want me as an undergrad, yet they were paying me to be there and teach their students, right? And it was just like I'm basically teaching them the regular conversations that I would have in a building lobby with my boys.
Right, like what we would be talking about at like a train
that
station.
We would talk about at like a bodega.
Yeah, it's
or like
all right.
walking from somewhere, and helping them expand their perspective to recognize how certain institutions take away and others contribute, and the way why the system is the way it is.
Well, you're outstanding.
So that part was really cool.
Yeah, you're outstanding. Like when I saw that you were at Harvard and what I've seen you achieve, and like you acknowledged we met at the National Latino Law Students Association. So like shout out to student groups and the power of student organizing, because it impacted my life in a dramatic way. That's actually one of the reasons I'm at higher ed. But I'm just really grateful that you made time. Like you are a fantastic example for our students and for anybody that's listening. So if they want to follow you, because I just want to close the space, if they want to follow you, how do they follow you? And is it okay for them to ask you questions, or like how would you suggest?
Yeah, it's always okay to ask questions. I recommend it.
He
and
recommends
one of the things I would say to any student is that you'll be surprised how if you just do a few Google searches, find somebody's email, whether they're at a big law firm, whether they're at a company you want to go to, that if you just reach out and say, hey, my name is such and such, I just found you online and I want to ask you a few questions. I want to learn more about X. People would be receptive and willing to talk with you and make time. Because certainly people have made time to talk to us, and we wouldn't be here without those that came before us. And I'm on social media, so my tags are, so it's Jorge, Jorge, Vasquez, V as in Victor, ASQUEZ, NY or NYC, either or, on Twitter, on all social media platforms.
And then follow your firm. Remind them of your firm.
Sure. It's V as in Vasquez, S as in Cigarra, LLP Law. And we're on IG, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn.
Okay, Jorge. Close.
Ask any questions.
Close this space for me and give me like one line, like the best advice you have for a young person who wants to be successful, like a one-liner, and then I'm going to let you close this space. But thank you so much for joining us, for being a national, I would say international example of Latino excellence and the Lower East Side. Big up to Cherry Street, Titi, tu sabes, yo te amo. I had to. And for just like really representing also public school students really well, because I think it's really important that you mentioned that you started in public school. So your best one-liner.
Yeah, no pressure.
Never, not with me.
It sounds cheesy, but you got this. You know what I mean? Like, stuff that doesn't make sense now will make sense later on. Just push forward. It's okay to have doubt. It's okay not to want to do something. But once you keep pushing, you'll get where you need to get. And just remember, there's tons of folks like me, like Talia, who came before you, who have similar, outcomes or obstacles. And we're here for you, right? So regardless of how alone you feel, you're not alone. People who haven't met you are rooting for you. And if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out.
Perfect. Hit us up. Thank you. I really appreciate you, Sam.
All right, thanks.
All right.
All right, bye.
Bye. So obviously he's a genius. That's a homie.
Latinas make history every day. Okay.
Can you read it for me?
Well, how do you say this one?
Latinas.
Latinas make history every day. Okay.